Good evening, HillmanTok University. How you doing? I am your professor. This summer, we are going to have a pretty good time, I think. Welcome to class. This is African American History 201, and this is lecture number one, HillmanTok University. If you're not familiar with HillmanTok University, I would encourage you to Google this. It is a movement. So this class is about the role of the Black professional in the modern civil rights movement, right? We understand what happened back in the day, but what is the role today? We want to talk about that this semester. And to do that, of course, we have to look at the past some, but we want to bring that up to the present. All right. So let's start with the past. Everybody knows the name Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Obviously, we know Dr. King. Well, here's the thing. In 1957, Dr. King actually addressed a national group of Black beauticians. The topic he talked about was the role of beauticians in the contemporary struggle for freedom. That might sound odd. What is Dr. King talking to these beauticians for? And again, this is 1957. The reason why that's important is because the Montgomery bus boycott ends at the end of 56. Dr. King is becoming this big star, right? And so February of 1957, he actually appears on the cover of Time magazine. Now, today we think about people going viral, like going, you're just getting all the clicks. That is nothing compared to being on the cover of Time magazine in 1957. Particularly for a Black person to be on the cover of Time magazine, because that was extremely rare. So in the history of that magazine, before that, you only had a handful of people. So Haile Selassie in 1930, but again, he's out of Ethiopia. Jackie Robinson appears on the cover of Time magazine in 1950. So it takes 20 years to get another Black person on the cover. You have Kwame Nkrumah in 1953, but again, some other guy in Africa. Thurgood Marshall makes an appearance in 1955. So again, he gets that magic touch and he goes to the highest heights of his profession. He becomes a Supreme Court justice. And then, of course, Dr. King in February 1957. This is beyond going viral. So in that context, you got to understand, he takes the time to talk to Black beauticians. Why is that important? Dr. Tiffany Gill from Rutgers University, she wrote a book called Beauty Shop Politics, African American Women's Activism in the Beauty Industry. I would encourage you to look at that. Beauticians were extremely important in the movement. Little known history, like they were super important. First of all, they have physical spaces that we can utilize. Remember, this is a time when Black people don't own or control very much. And so these beauticians have physical spaces. That's important. You can meet, you can do things, you can organize, you can do activism out of these physical spaces. These are also physical spaces that are not on the radar, right? So I talked about, again, Dr. Gill wrote this beautiful book. She talks about how the FBI definitely was tracking the barbershops. They would send informants into the barbershops. The FBI was definitely tracking Black churches. Black churches were being bombed, but nobody was checking for the beauty salon. They just figured there's some women gossiping. Like, who cares about that? Totally off the radar. But they're doing voter registration. They're doing all this kind of stuff. They're also trusted, right? Because you trust your beautician. Don't laugh, but I go to the barbershop every week. And the idea of a man standing over me with a razor blade this close to my eye, you've got to really trust a person to do that. So there's a high level of trust that's happening here. So these are people that the community trusts. But they're also people who are extremely independent. You can't fire a beautician, right? You can't. They are their own boss. Their customers are all Black. Their suppliers are Black. This is a time when, today we think about the Black beauty supply industry being ran by non-Black people. We sort of manufactured ourselves. So their entire world is Black. They're dependent on Black people who like their activism. They like the idea of a freedom struggle. They can't do anything to these people outside of violence, right? Which is always a threat. So these beauticians are extremely important if you're going to organize in Black communities. That's where it's at. And so Dr. King makes it a point to talk to him, to those people. Dr. King also makes it a point to check for people like Norris Herndon. Norris Herndon was the head of Atlanta Life Insurance. Atlanta Life Insurance was the biggest Black-owned insurance company in the world at that point. They would ultimately have a presence in like 17 different states. Now, Norris Herndon's dad started the company, Alonzo Herndon. He was formerly enslaved. He starts as a barber, gets into real estate, starts building this insurance company. He leaves it to his son, and his son just blows it out. His son would go on to have a fortune estimated at like $100 million. Norris Herndon builds Herndon Stadium in Atlanta. Norris Herndon Scholars have found communications back and forth between Dr. King and Norris Herndon. They're talking all the time, and Dr. King's like all in his face because he's cutting checks, right? Dr. King is constantly saying, thank you for, funding this. Thank you for that. He needs a Norris Herndon. Also go back to 1960. Dr. King had never really been like a street protest kind of guy. And sort of his first foray into that was the student movement in Atlanta in 1960. So you think about the sit-in movements with students across the country. Well, this starts to happen in Atlanta in 1960. No students go out there. The first protest, they go out there and they got these raggedy signs. And you know who called those students in to help them out? It was Norris Herndon, right? So Dr. King is talking to people like this, these beauticians, the Norris Herndons of the world. But here's the thing. Are these Black professionals or are these Black entrepreneurs, right? Because if we distinguish Black professionals from Black entrepreneurs, this calculation looks a little bit different. Does the movement rely on Black professionals, or is Dr. King relying on Black entrepreneurs? Because if we make that distinction, the truth is Black professionals were always extremely limited in the movement. So this is why the beauticians are important, because they're independent. You can always stop somebody from protesting with just the threat of losing their job. And that was like the number one weapon, right? So if you're a teacher or a school principal, you can't go out there protesting. You won't have a job tomorrow, right? Even if you're a blue collar worker, if you're just a Black woman who works in somebody's home or a Black man digging ditches, let somebody find out that you're in a protest. That's not going to work out for you. So Black professionals were always extremely limited in the movement. They couldn't do all these things. Dr. King is relying on people who can, and it's not the people who are on somebody's payroll. And the reality is not a whole lot has changed today, because Black people right now today who have a job can't even post on social media. Like, we're afraid to actually post how we feel on social media because we got a job. We can't be seen in that light. We can't let our employer or our coworkers, we got to keep a job. Well, hold on now. Dr. King was shot in 1968. We're talking about close to 60 years ago, and we're still walking around afraid to do advocacy or be vocal about our feelings. That's a problem. So how do we get there? How do we get a situation where 60 years close to Dr. King being shot, we are still, as Black professionals, kind of in the same loop? And the answer goes back to sort of the flaws of the civil rights movement in itself, right? Because what we have is a situation where the movement sort of starts on a course where the focus maybe is not completely as it should be. Because this wasn't the first movement for freedom. It's not like Black people woke up in 1950 and said, we should do something, right? Black people have been doing stuff all along. And the first huge movement like that, right, is the Reconstruction movement. After the Civil War, a lot of things happened that where Black people get lots of rights, right? So the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s basically is a 100-year loop to get the same rights that were given 100 years ago. So the big piece of legislation was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This is, again, right after the Civil War ends. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 looks at, okay, let's define citizenship. Let's make sure everyone's a citizen. Let's give everyone the rights that a citizen should have, just like white people. Let's make sure every person, is not treated differently based on race. This is 1866. This is not 1960s. This is 1866. Let me be very clear. This is the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Congress pushes this through. President Andrew Johnson said, no, I'm not doing that. Like, Andrew Johnson was a complete racist. And he was like, just no. Well, Congress has to override his veto, which is the first time that this happens, to my knowledge. And they passed this bill. This is okay, cool. After that, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1875 says, let's look at public accommodations more closely. Let's make sure you can use the theaters. You can go sit in the opera houses. You can, right? Public accommodations. Let's make sure you can go everywhere. And again, I should say this, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, it also has penalties. They say, okay, you can't deprive somebody of their rights. And if you do so, we can put a fine on you not to exceed $1,000 or imprisonment not to exceed a year or both. So there are penalties, but it's on the person to go pursue it. In fairness, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does add federal penalties, right? So it's not on the person to have to go to court and prove this, but you get the point. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1965 don't grant Black people any new rights that we hadn't had before. Because again, if you go back to the Reconstruction era, all those rights are given. The 15th Amendment, of course, gives the voting rights to males, not women. You have a lot of people running for office, Black folks. Louisiana has a Black governor. There was even talk about a Black vice presidential candidate. Like, a lot of things happened in that era that you would think was 1960, 1970. This is 1860, 1870, right? And of course, that ends after, I'm blanking out, the Compromise of 1877, right? That's a different story for a different day. But you get the point. No new rights are happening. So again, how did we go into a 100-year loop? Like, how do we get there to where Black professionals can't protest? They're leaning on Black beauticians, because there were a lot of people, for example, if you wanted to join the NAACP, after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, that was illegal in certain states like South Carolina. So if you want to be a part of NAACP, you got to hide that. So again, I talked about this book. Excuse me. I talked about this book, Dr. Tiffany Gill, Beauty Shop Politics, African-American Women's Activism in the Beauty Industry. She talks about how people were getting their mail sent to the beauty salon because they didn't want people to know that they were down with the NAACP. Like, and Black professionals are still walking around hiding. How do we get there? Dr. King says something in his book, his last book, actually, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. There's a quote that I like, and I think it's interesting. He says, and I quote, "To sit at a lunch counter or occupy the front seat of a bus had no effect on our material standard of living. But in removing a caste stigma, it revolutionized our psychology and elevated the spiritual content of our being. Instinctively, we struck out for dignity first, because personal degradation as an inferior human being was even more keenly felt than material privation." He's saying that being able to sit at this lunch counter didn't actually change our lives in any like material way. It just made us feel better. To be called the N-word all day long and be called boy and just be degraded, that made me feel worse than being poor sometimes. So we went out for that first. We wanted to address the personal dignity part first. He's saying that was our focus. And the problem is that focus was fulfilled. They got that, and that was about it. Because in 1965, Dr. King does an interview with Playboy magazine, and he says, and I quote, what little progress has been made, and that includes the Civil Rights Act, has applied primarily to the middle-class Negro. Among the masses, especially in the northern ghettos, the situation remains about the same, and for some, it is worse. In other words, not a whole lot changed. A few Black professionals got a little bit of a come up, right? As the government starts looking at affirmative action policies to try to include a few Black people, they're not pulling Black people out the ghetto. They're getting Black middle class people. Black professionals have a few things opening up. That's about it. So the Black professional who couldn't actually go out and really protest too vocally, who did the least, well, I won't say the least, right? They got the most benefit from this whole deal. Isn't that interesting, right? And then that same year, 1965, there's this huge riot in the Watts neighborhood in Los Angeles. Right, like I think literally a week after the Voting Rights Act passed, this whole neighborhood goes in flames. Now you would say, well, that's weird. The Voting Rights Act seems like progress, so why is everyone so mad? Well, a year after Watts, this publication, Ramparts magazine, says, and I quote, after more than a decade of the civil rights movement, the Black American in Harlem, Haynesville, Baltimore, and Bogalusa is worse off today than he was 10 years ago. The movement's leaders know it, and it is the source of their despair. The movement is in despair because it has been forced to recognize the Negro Revolution as a myth. So Dr. King is admitting, and other people are looking at this and saying, this didn't really do much for us. This didn't really create the change that we thought. And in fact, it's merely a restoration of rights that were given 100 years earlier. And so here you have Black professionals benefiting slightly, but materially, we still haven't seen that evolution where people actually have self-determination. People can actually get on Facebook and say how I really feel. People are still having to hide their advocacy and hide their feelings because we live in a world under white dominance. A world where all the means of production, all the institutions are controlled by white people, frankly. And I think the movement's leaders sort of looked at this world that they had, and practically they said, okay, we concede to white dominance. We just want a little more dignity. We want a little more access for a few people. And that was the exchange. And this is the world that we have. We do have more access. I don't get called the N-word walking down the street every day. I can walk into the restaurants and all these things, and yet I still can't post openly, even on social media, how I feel about a police shooting. Right? This is the world that we have because we assume white dominance, and the movement sort of followed that track. And you can see it even now when we look back at, let's say, Brown versus Board of Education. A lot of people see that and interpret that as, if we can just sit next to white people, life will be better and education will be better. Right. But there's an education scholar by the name of Dr. Ivory Tolson, and he pointed out last year that when we talk about segregated schools, we often make this assumption that black instruction was inferior. And he points out that that's actually not true. And in many cases, these black teachers were more qualified than their white peers. Now, the buildings may have been inferior, some of the resources, but not the quality of instruction. Right. But there's this assumption of whiteness being superior. There's this assumption of white dominance. And certainly if your ice is just colder, like there's that thing happening here. And you can see that sort of in the movement in some ways. So when we look at Brown versus Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education is this larger movement to sort of attack separate but equal. Well, one of the chief strategists is a guy by the name of Charles Hamilton Houston. He's an attorney. He was the dean at Howard Law School, a brilliant man. He's one of the chief strategists. They don't immediately go after elementary schools because what white people really don't want is little Quincy sitting next to Susie like that. We don't want that. Right. So they start with the professional schools, like a law school. That's a pretty good target. Right. Trade schools, law schools, those sort of things. The case that really breaks this open is the University of Oklahoma. And so there is a black woman by the name of, excuse me, Ada Lois Scipio Fisher. She applies to go to law school at the University of Oklahoma. And they say, you are out of your mind, little Negro girl, if you think you're going to Oklahoma. We ain't doing that. Tell you what, though, because of Plessy versus Ferguson back in the day, separate but equal is the law of the land. So I tell you what, can't go to Oklahoma, but we will build you a school at Langston University. How about that? So Langston is an HBCU in Oklahoma. So I say, OK. But the NAACP and all these black attorneys say, you know what? You said separate but equal. And this law school at Langston that you put together in like 6 minutes is clearly not equal. So let's go back to court and make you honor separate but equal. You got to let her into Oklahoma. And she does. 1949 is the year. She is the first black woman to go, black person to go. She goes to the University of Oklahoma Law School. That's 1949. Now, ironically, 2 years earlier, 1947, Southern University, which is another HBCU in Louisiana, they opened their law school. OK, 2 years earlier, Southern University opens a law school. Now, incidentally, I have had a grandfather, not my biological grandfather, but like my play grandfather, not, he actually went to Southern University. He was a Navy guy. He was able to get the GI Bill. He's one of the few black people who did. That's a whole nother story. And he goes to Southern University. And he always talked about how much he loved Southern. Southern was just like Jesus Christ or something like that. And one of the things that he used to talk about is in Louisiana, they really meant separate but equal. And so not perfectly, right, but they did try to keep up this thing of if we build, so Southern's in Baton Rouge, right? LSU is also in Baton Rouge. So if they build a basketball arena for LSU, they're going to build one for Southern. If they build this, right, they tried to kind of keep up this thing as much as they could. And the same thing happens there, right? They say, we do not want you Negroes coming to this law school. We'll build you one over here. And they said, fine, we will use state funds to build a black institution. And they did. Now, ask me where the law school at Langston is. It doesn't exist because 12 days after that decision, that law school closed. They don't have a law school. And so you see this question here of, maybe a different approach could have been taken. It's just a thought experiment. Rather than fighting for integration, should the fight have been for equal? Right? In other words, They went back to court to make them honor separate but equal in the form of let her into Oklahoma versus, okay, build another law school and make sure it's equal. It's just a thought experiment because now we're looking at a situation where there isn't this Black institution. There isn't that possibility. Southern still has that law school today. They're still turning out Black attorneys. There's right. It raises a question here. Now, again, it's understandable why these people would take that course. It's understandable why they may feel like they have to concede the white dominance because they're literally living under terrorism, like big time. The idea of standing up will get you killed. But the question is, if you're going to stand up for integration, why not stand up for the other? Like, if you're going to get killed either way, again, it's just a question. But it's understandable. And I always point to the example of Booker T. Washington's book, Up from Slavery. He talks about a guy who was sold from West Virginia into Alabama. Now, remember, the international slave trade is abolished in, I think, 1808. I'm blanking off the top of my head, but I think it's like 1808 under Thomas Jefferson. Well, what this does is it's like having any other luxury item. If you have a really expensive car, you don't want everyone to have it, right? So one of the things it does is it restricts the supply of enslaved people. So if you're someone like Thomas Jefferson and you're in a Virginia or West Virginia or Kentucky where they don't need as many bodies, well, they need a lot of them in Mississippi and Alabama because they're expanding the cotton production. You just sell them further south. Now you make all the money. And this is what happens. So there's this guy in this book who gets sold from West Virginia to Alabama. And they said, well, how many of you all were sold? And he said, there was 5 of us. And he lists me, my brother, and 3 mules. Everybody stop and think about that. He said, there were 5 of us. He said, me, my brother, and 3 mules. That's where these people are coming from. So in a sense, you sort of understand why they may concede to that world where they can't openly be vocal, they can't resist, they can't really be honest with their feelings, and they have to do these things. But the reality is we are still accepting that today, right? We still have Black professionals today who can't be vocal about their feelings, who can't really be that Black, who can't, you know what I mean? Like every single day we watch people. A good example is I remember people talking when Barack Obama got elected. And the conversation was always, well, he can't do this. He can't, because he's Black, he got that's sort of every Black professional in the world. We all sort of move like that, where it's like, I can't really I can't really hook my friends up. I can't put my boy in a contract. We're still kind of conceding to that world. So the first thing is first, the question for Black professionals today is, what world do we want? Do we still want to sort of fight for access and rights? Because what we've seen historically is rights can be taken away in a minute. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1866. We had the Civil Rights Act of 1875. We had the 14th Amendment. We had the 15th Amendment. And 100 years later, we still need a whole nother movement. Okay, Dr. King was shot in 1968, and we're still in the streets. What world do we want to live in? Do we want the world of rights and access? Or do we want a world where people challenge white dominance and say, you know what, I actually don't agree that every institution and means of production should be controlled by white people. I don't agree that my labor should be owned by white people. Because if you think critically, since Black folk have come to this country, the first Blacks get here in 1526 with the Spanish. They come to South Carolina, they rebel, turn up, and then they got integrated with the native population. The British started in 1619 in Virginia. Since that time to now, Black people have labor and work for the benefit of white people. Like, I don't care if you're LeBron James and you make millions playing for the NBA, you play for an owner. That basic dynamic has not changed. So the Black professional today has to really have a conversation. Like, we may need to have a huddle and say, okay, do we want to keep doing this thing for the next 100 years? Or do we actually want to fight for something different? Because in a sense, what we're saying is we have lived in a world where our life outcomes have been 100% dependent on how white people feel about me, whether it's getting that scholarship, whether it's getting that first job or that 5th job. Do we want our children to live in that same world where their life outcomes are dependent on how much white people like them? If history is to be a guide, I don't think that's a thing. Like, I can't imagine after the Holocaust, Jewish people saying, you know what, I'm okay with, Nazis controlling everything and Just be nicer. I can't imagine that. I can't. I can't imagine white people today saying, I am completely comfortable with black people running everything in my world. And yet this is the world that we sort of wake up in. And it's not to say that we can change it today. A lot has to happen. But are we okay with that? What are the goals? That is the question that we have to start with for the black professional. So often people say, well, what should we do? Nothing. We shouldn't, because we have to agree on the goals. We have to have an inner conference to figure out what are we going for here, because no strategy can be effective unless we actually agree on where we're going. All right. So before we end it, next week, we're going to be back at, again, HillmanTok University. I'm excited about this semester. However, I'll also have a course. It's called Race Critical. Race, just like it sounds, Race Critical. Go to racecritical.com. If you have particularly young people in your life, especially high school students, junior high students, or if you even have younger kids, you want to make sure that you understand and have a good grasp on history to teach them, because they're not getting a lot of things in school. They're just not. Race Critical is a course that looks at the world critically. We want children to do critical thinking. And it's not about just pointing at people and saying who's bad or who's good. It's a critical history that says, okay, this is what happened, but why? Why did people do what they did? Right? Young people need to think critically and understand the world that they have so that they can succeed in it. So please check out racecritical.com if you want a little bit more for young people in your life. But again, next week we'll be at it. Thank you so much for joining me. HillmanTok University, summer 2025. So I'll get at you all next week.